The map was drawn in her father's own hand, in the autumn of 1810, upon a sheet of cartridge paper near 4 feet by 3, and it hung still, rolled in a canvas sleeve upon the top shelf of the cupboard in her narrow room above the schoolroom at Sleaford, where Frances Standish had not unrolled it in above a 12-month, though she had never once thought of putting it upon the fire. It showed the water meadows of Otterbourne, out in the fen country east of the town, as they had lain 9 years before, the long, low levels between the River Slee and the drain her father had cut with his own instruments, the sluice gates marked in fine red ink at every crossing. The elevations noted in his small, precise figures spelled out to the quarter-inch, the whole surveyed and drawn over one long autumn, when he had been engineer to the old Earl of Otterbourne, and she, a girl of 8 and 10, had carried his chain across the wet grass and held his level steady against the wind off the German Ocean while he read the staff and called the numbers back to her to write down in a book bound in black oilcloth that she still kept, with his other books, in the bottom drawer of the press. She was 27 now, and a schoolmistress, and had been one for 6 years, since her father's death left her mother's small annuity to be eked out by whatever a clergyman's widow's daughter with a good hand and a better head for figures might honestly earn, and she taught arithmetic and plain drawing and a little geography to the daughters of Sleaford's attorneys and corn factors in a square brick house with a green door, and she was, by the account of everyone who knew her, a composed, sensible, and entirely unremarkable young woman, given to neither raised voice nor lowered eye, who walked to church on Sundays with her widowed aunt and kept her own counsel the rest of the week. What almost nobody in Sleaford knew, for she had never found an occasion to mention it, and would not have known how to mention it without sounding as though she claimed for herself an accomplishment no woman was thought to want, was that she could read a spirit level as truly as any man her father had trained, that she understood the fall of a drain and the run of a sluice, and the difference between a fen that would hold its water and one that would not, and that on the long wet evenings of her girlhood, while other daughters of the neighborhood had been taught to play upon the pianoforte or to paint in watercolors, she had been taught instead to read the country the way her father read it, not for its prettiness, but for its levels. It was a wet November that year, the 8th of the month, a Tuesday, and rain enough in October to have put half the low ground in Lincolnshire under water, when the letter came that would take her away from Sleaford and put her, before the year was out, in the middle of another family's ruin and a whole valley's harvest. The letter was from the Reverend Josiah Ashdown, curate of Quarrington Fen, a parish some 14 miles from Sleaford on the far side of the river, and a man Frances had met exactly twice in her life, both times at her father's table when she had been a girl too young to be spoken to beyond a civil word. It was addressed to her aunt's house on Handley Street, and it was written, she could see from the unevenness of the hand, in some haste and some distress. "Madam," it began, for he did not know her well enough to presume upon her Christian name, "I write to you at the especial desire of the Dowager Countess of Otterbourne, who has done me the honor of consulting me as to whether any person now living might supply the want, in this present emergency, of the late Mr. Standish's knowledge of the water meadows at Otterbourne. Her ladyship recollects that you assisted your father in his surveys as a girl, and that you have since kept, she believes, his books and instruments. I will not conceal from you that the matter is urgent. The autumn floods have not gone off the low meadows as they ought, the main drain having silted these 3 years past under Mr. Sowerby's management, and the home farm's Michaelmas rents are like to go by the board unless the water can be got off the ground before the frost sets hard. Her ladyship desires me to ask whether you would be willing to come into Lincolnshire for a season, upon terms to be settled by the Earl's solicitor, to advise upon the drain and the sluices as your late father would have done. I am aware that this is a strange request to make of a lady, and I would not make it at all were the case not, in my own plain judgment, a very bad one. Frances read the letter twice at her aunt's breakfast table, and then a third time standing at the window, where the light was better, and then she folded it along its own creases and sat for some minutes with her hands quiet in her lap, which was, her aunt would have told anyone who asked, exactly what Frances Standish did when she was most moved and least inclined to show it. Her aunt, Mrs. Judith Marlott, a widow of comfortable means and decided opinions who had kept house for Frances these 6 years and asked for nothing in return but her company and her arm to church, watched her over the teapot and said nothing for a good while, which was in its way a kindness, for she understood that her niece did not think aloud, but read a thing through twice in silence before she would speak of it at all. "Well," said Mrs. Marlott at last, when the toast had gone cold and the tea twice poured, "and what does Mr. Ashdown want of you, that has left you sitting there like a woman doing sums in her head?" "He wants my father," said Frances. "Since he cannot have him, he will take what is left, which is his books and his daughter." She told her aunt the substance of it, and watched her aunt's face travel from surprise to frank astonishment to something that was, by the end, very like delight, for Mrs. Marlott had buried one husband and outlived 2 brothers, and had a fen woman's own contempt for the notion that a woman's understanding stopped short wherever a man's convenience required it to stop. "They want you to go and read their water for them," said Mrs. Marlott, "because their own steward has let the drain choke and cannot, or will not, tell them why the meadows will not dry. And you are sitting there wondering whether it would be unbecoming in you to go." "I am wondering," said Frances, "whether it would be of any use. A woman arriving with a spirit level and her father's old book of levels is not, I think, what the Earl of Otterbourne's steward is expecting to answer for his season's neglect, and there is no reason he should receive it kindly." "There is every reason he should receive it however he pleases," said her aunt, "provided the drain runs and the rents are paid. You do not owe Mr. Sowerby, whoever he is, the comfort of finding you agreeable. You owe the Dowager Countess, who has asked you a civil question, a civil answer, and I think the civil answer is yes." It took Frances 2 further days, and 1 further letter, this one directed to her, over the Dowager Countess's own hand, a short, plain, unflattering letter that asked nothing of her but the truth of the ground, and offered nothing in return but a fair wage and her keep for the season, which was, Frances thought, exactly the sort of letter she would have wished to receive, being neither too proud to ask nor too anxious to persuade, before she wrote her acceptance and began, with her aunt's help, to pack her father's instruments. There were not many of them. A spirit level in its case, the glass unbroken these 18 years, that her father had bought new in Boston the year before she was born, a staff, graduated in his own hand where the printed figures had worn from the wood, a chain 50 links that she coiled herself the way he had taught her, without a kink in it. And the books, 4 of them, black oilcloth, close written, the surveys of half the fen country east of Sleaford recorded in a hand that grew, over the years she had known it, from a young man's confident upright to an older man's smaller and more careful script, as though he had come, by the end, to trust his eye less and his figures more. She packed the Otterbourne map last, rolled again in its canvas sleeve, and did not look at it as she packed it, for she had looked at it enough already, lying awake the 2 nights since the letter came, tracing with her finger in the dark the line of the main drain as she remembered it, wondering what 9 years and Mr. Sowerby's neglect might have done to ground that had, when her father surveyed it, been the best drained land in that part of Lincolnshire. Aunt Judith would go with her. This was settled between them within the hour of Frances's decision, and neither woman troubled to discuss it as though it might have been otherwise. For a widow of Mrs. Marlett's years and character made an unimpeachable chaperone, and Frances, though composed enough in her own right, was not so lost to the ordinary proprieties as to travel into Lincolnshire and lodge for a season upon a strange estate without a female relation at her elbow. They set out on the 11th of November, a cold, still, colorless morning, the fen mist lying along the low ground on either side of the Sleaford road, so that the willows stood up out of it like masts out of a gray sea. And Frances sat with her father's level case upon her knees the whole of the journey, and did not speak above a dozen words until they changed horses at Ruskington, where she got down to walk a little in the yard, and found the ostler's boy staring frankly at the black oilcloth cases stacked beside her trunk. "Instruments, miss?" he said, for he had never seen a lady travel with such things. "My father's," said Frances. "I go to read some water with them." The boy considered this with the grave attention children give to things they do not understand, but suspect may be important, and said nothing further, and Frances got back into the chaise and watched the fen unroll past the window, flat and wet and silver, under a sky the color of a dove's wing, thinking, not for the first time in those 2 days, that she was undertaking a thing no one in Sleaford would have thought to ask of her, and that she meant, all the same, to do it as well as her father would have done it, or not at all. The road from Ruskington ran on through Anwick and Ewerby, and so down into the fen proper, where the land dropped by degrees until the church towers stood higher than anything else for miles, and the dikes ran arrow straight between the fields. And Frances found herself, despite the cold and the jolting of the chaise and her aunt's determined conversation upon the subject of the Dowager Countess's probable manners, reading the country as they passed through it with an attention she had not given to any landscape in 6 years. The fall of the ground, the state of the drains, the black wet gleam of water standing in fields that ought by the second week of November to have been drying toward the plough. "It is worse than I feared," she said once, half to herself, looking out at a long, low meadow where the water lay in sheets between the tussocks, and a heron stood in the middle distance as though the whole field had been made over to him. "Is that Otterbourne ground?" asked her aunt. "Not yet. But it drains the same way, and if the neighbor's land stands like that, I do not think Otterbourne's own meadows can be much better." They came into Quarrington Fen a little before 4 o'clock, in the thin gray light of a fen afternoon already going toward dusk, and the first sight Frances had of Otterbourne Hall was from the rise above the village where the road crested a low bank, the only rise of any consequence for miles, and showed her, across a full 2 miles of flat water meadow, a long gray stone house with a pillared front and tall sash windows catching what light remained of the day, and beyond it, dark against the paler sky, the shapes of great trees that must mark the park, and beyond that again, flat to the horizon, the fen itself, criss-crossed with dikes that showed, even at that distance and in that failing light, altogether too much standing water for the season. Frances looked at it for a long moment before the chaise dropped below the rise and the house went out of sight behind the willows, and she thought, with the peculiar clarity that came to her only when she was looking at ground and not at people, that whatever the Earl of Otterbourne's steward had been doing with the drain these 3 years, he had not been doing the thing her father had taught her to call, without much charity, the only thing that mattered, keeping the water moving. The hall itself, when the chaise turned at last up the carriage sweep and drew to a halt before the pillared front, wore its distress more quietly than the fields had. For stone does not show a flood the way grass does, and the lamps were lit along the front in a manner that spoke of a household still keeping up appearances against whatever ruin threatened it from the low ground below. But Frances, climbing down stiff from 2 days' travel with her aunt's hand under her elbow, saw at once, in the single lit window of what must be the steward's office at the end of the west wing, a man's shape bent over a desk, who did not rise or come to the window at the sound of wheels on gravel, and thought that a steward with an easy conscience about his own accounts generally came to see, who arrived. They were received by the butler, a spare, gray, upright man of some 60 years named Pargeter, who had plainly been told to expect them and who conducted them, with a correctness that gave away nothing of his own opinion on the matter, to a small sitting room where a fire had been kept burning, and where, after some minutes, the Dowager Countess of Otterbourne came in to receive them herself, without ceremony, in a plain gray gown. A tall, upright woman of perhaps 60 years, with a direct gray eye and the unmistakable manner of a woman who had run a large household competently for a very long time and did not intend to waste anyone's time, including her own. "Miss Standish," she said, taking both Frances's hands in a manner more usually kept for old friends than for a schoolmistress arrived on hire, "I am very glad you have come, and very sorry for the reason. Your father surveyed this ground when my husband held the earldom, and I have not forgotten it, though I own I did not think, when I asked Mr. Ashdown to write to you, that I had any real hope of an answer. Mrs. Marlotte, you are very welcome. You will both want your dinner and your beds before anything else is said of drains or sluices, and I mean to see you have both before I ask you a single question." Frances, who had expected a colder reception, or at best a merely correct one, found herself unexpectedly moved by this, and said only that she hoped she would be of use, to which the Dowager Countess replied, with a dry look that Frances would come in time to recognize as characteristic of her, that she hoped so too, since the alternative was that half the tenantry went into the new year owing rent they could not pay on land that could not be worked, and that this was not a prospect she meant to face without a fight. It was over dinner, a plain, good dinner, taken early on account of the journey, at which the Dowager Countess presided with her son notably absent, being from home that day upon some business connected with the very difficulty in question that Frances first heard. In outline, the shape of the trouble at Otterbourne, how the old earl had died some 6 years since, and the earldom passed to his elder son, who had held it only 2 years before a fall from his horse on the Lincoln road left it, in turn, to his younger brother, the present earl, a man Frances had not yet met, and of whom the Dowager Countess spoke with a careful, measured affection that told Frances more, in its restraint, than a warmer account would have done, how the estate had come to the present earl encumbered with debts left by his brother's improvident years, debts that a series of good harvests might in the ordinary course have gone some way to clearing, and how instead the water meadows that were the estate's best land and the home farm's chief dependence had failed to drain properly for 3 seasons running, under the management of a steward, Mr. Ezra Sowerby, who blamed the weather and the age of the works and the general unkindness of Providence toward Lincolnshire, for a state of affairs that Frances, before she had so much as walked the ground by daylight, already suspected owed less to Providence than to neglect. "He is a plausible man," said the Dowager Countess of her steward, with the particular dryness of a woman who has been talked at length by a plausible man and has not enjoyed it, and he has an answer for everything, which is very nearly the surest sign I know that a man's accounts will not bear close looking into. My son has looked into them as closely as his own knowledge allows, which is closer than most gentlemen would trouble to look. But he does not know a sluice from a hurdle, and nor, forgive me, did his father, and nor do I, and Mr. Sowerby has been very willing to take advantage of the fact. We need someone who does know a sluice from a hurdle, Miss Standish, and who owes Mr. Sowerby nothing, and I do not know above one such person now living, and she is sitting at my table. Frances slept that night in a plain, clean, comfortable chamber under the hall's eaves, with her father's books stacked upon the table beside the bed, and lay some while listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a great house settling for the night, and thinking that she had come a long way in 6 years from carrying a chain across wet grass for a father who was still in those years alive to call the numbers back to her, and that she meant before the winter was out to answer the Dowager Countess's trust in the only coin she had ever truly owned, which was the plain, unglamorous, entirely reliable truth of the ground. She rose before the household the next morning, dressed in her plainest traveling gown and a pair of pattens against the wet, and was out upon the home meadows with her father's level and staff, while the mist still lay along the dikes and the rooks were only beginning to stir in the tall trees above the church. And it was there, a little before 8 o'clock, walking the bank of the main drain with the staff over her shoulder and a borrowed laborer named Tom Redlock carrying her chain, that she had her first sight of the ruin Mr. Sowerby's stewardship had made of her father's work. The drain, which her father's map showed running true and deep from the home farm sluice down to the tidal doors 3 miles below, was in places so choked with silt and willow growth that Frances could have stepped across it dry-shod, and where it did run, it ran shallow and slow, backed up behind a series of small, unauthorized, badly built dams that some tenant or other had thrown across it in a private and understandable effort to keep water on his own land at his neighbor's expense, in the absence of any proper management to prevent him. The home farm sluice itself, when she came to it after an hour's walking, was worse than she had feared. The gate hung crooked on one hinge, the timber sill beneath it rotted through in 2 places, and the whole structure patched, not rebuilt, with new boards nailed across old rot in a manner that told her at once, before she had opened a single account book, that whatever sums had been charged to the estate for the sluice's repair in the last 3 years, they had not been spent upon the sluice. "That were done twice since Michaelmas 12-month," said Tom Redlock, setting down the chain and looking at the patched gate with the flat, unsurprised contempt of a man who had watched the same thing happen more than once. "New boards, new price, same rot underneath. I told Mr. Sowerby myself the sill wanted taking up and relaying proper, and he told me mind my own drains and he'd mind the estate's. And did you mind your own drains?" asked Frances, crouching to lay her hand flat against the rotten timber, feeling it give soft and wet under her fingers where sound oak should have held firm. "I minded 'em as well as any man can mind a drain that's backed up 3 foot above where it ought to stand, miss, which is to say not well at all. There's not a tenant on this fen this 12-month past that's had a dry root crop, and there's some, begging your pardon, that's said openly they'll not pay Michaelmas rent on ground they couldn't work, and I don't know as I blame 'em, though it's like to go hard with the estate if they don't." Frances set up her level a little above the sluice, upon a dry hummock that gave her a clear sight along the line of the drain in both directions, and spent the better part of 2 hours reading the fall of the ground exactly as her father had taught her, patiently, methodically, recording every reading in a fresh book she had brought for the purpose, checking each figure twice before she trusted it, and building up, staff reading by staff reading, a picture of the drain's true condition that no amount of Mr. Sowerby's plausible talk could have given the Dowager Countess in a 12-month of Sundays. By the time she had worked her way down to the second sluice, a mile below the first, where the same pattern of new boards over old rot repeated itself with a consistency that struck her as almost too neat to be accident. The morning had burned off into a clear, cold, pale gold noon. And it was there, coming along the bank from the direction of the hall, with a spaniel at his heel, and no more ceremony than a man taking his own dog for a walk upon his own land, that Frances first saw the Earl of Otterbourne. He was a tall man, dark-haired, with gray-green eyes and a plain, weathered, unfashionable riding coat that told her nothing of his rank beyond the quiet authority with which Tom Redlock straightened at his approach and pulled his cap. A man of perhaps 36, composed rather than commanding in his bearing, who came to a halt a little way off and stood watching her read the staff for a full minute before he spoke, as though he judged it discourteous to interrupt a piece of work in progress, whoever was doing it. "Miss Standish," he said, when she had at last lowered the level and turned to acknowledge him, "my mother tells me I am to thank you for coming, and I find I do not know how to thank a lady properly for walking my drains in the wet before I have so much as had the civility to call on her myself. I am Otterbourne. I would have been here to receive you last night, but I was kept in Sleaford later than I intended, upon business that concerns, I think, exactly the ground you are standing on." "There is no thanks wanted, my lord," said Frances, in the plain, level voice she kept for schoolroom disputes and for men who expected either flattery or tears from a woman doing a man's work, and got neither. "I have not yet done anything to be thanked for. I have only looked, so far, and what I have looked at does not please me." "Nor me," he said, and came nearer, and looked, for the first time, not at her but past her, along the line of the drain toward the second sluice, with an attention that told her this was not a man wholly ignorant of his own land, whatever his mother had said of him and sluices and hurdles the night before. "Tell me plainly what you have found. I would rather have it plain and unpleasant than smoothed over, and I have had a great deal smoothed over these 3 years. So Frances told him, standing there on the bank, with the level still in her hand and Tom Redlock a respectful distance off pretending an interest in the chain, exactly what she had found: the choked drain, the unauthorized dams, the 2 patched sluices with new boards laid over rot that ought to have been taken up and relaid whole. The general character of the work is that of a man mending appearances rather than mending drains, and the Earl listened to the whole of it without once interrupting her, his face graver by degrees as she went on, until at the end he was silent a moment, looking out over the flooded meadow with an expression Frances could not quite read, though she thought there was more anger in it than surprise. "My steward has told me, 3 autumns running, that the fault lay with the season, and with works too old to answer any longer for the water they were built to carry," he said at last. "I am not a stupid man, Miss Standish, whatever Mr. Sowerby may privately think me, but I do not know a sluice from a hurdle, as my mother is fond of observing, and I had no way of proving him wrong that did not itself cost more than the estate could readily spare." "What would your father have said, looking at that sluice?" "My father would have said Frances, that a sill mended twice in 3 years and rotten both times underneath the mending had either been mended by a fool, which I do not think Mr. Sowerby is, or mended cheap on purpose while being charged for dear, which I think a good deal more likely, and which your own account books, my lord, if I might see them, would very probably confirm or deny within the week." It was, she reflected afterward, a bold thing to say to a peer of the realm she had known for less than a quarter of an hour, upon the strength of a rotten plank and a labourer's grumbling. But the Earl of Otterbourne did not look offended, only for the first time since he had come up the bank, faintly and grimly amused, in the manner of a man who has suspected a thing for a long while and is relieved, rather than affronted, to hear it said aloud by someone with the knowledge to say it. "You shall see whatever books you wish to see," he said. "My mother has told you, I think, the terms we propose. But I will say them again myself so there is no misunderstanding between us. You are engaged, for the season, to advise upon the drainage of the home farm and the water meadows, at a wage to be settled by my solicitor, Miss Locksley, who is coming down from Lincoln within the fortnight upon this very business. You will have the use of whatever men and materials the work requires, upon your own judgment of what is needed, and you will answer to me and to no one else, for what you find and what you recommend, whatever Mr. Sowerby's opinion of the arrangement may prove to be." "And what do you expect Mr. Sowerby's opinion of the arrangement to be?" asked Frances, who had already formed her own view of the lit window she had seen the evening before, and the man who had not troubled to come and see who arrived. "I expect," said the Earl of Otterbourne, with a dryness that reminded her, not for the first time that morning, of his mother, "that Mr. Sowerby will be extremely civil to your face and extremely busy behind your back, and I should be obliged if you would tell me at once, and not wait upon politeness, the moment you find any evidence of which." She did not have long to wait. Mr. Sowerby presented himself at the hall that same afternoon, having heard, by whatever channel such news traveled upon an estate, that a woman with instruments had been walking his drains since before breakfast, and was shown into the small sitting-room where Frances sat with the Dowager Countess, going through what account books the steward had, over the preceding 3 years, seen fit to render up for the Earl's inspection. He was a stout, high-colored man of perhaps 45, dressed a shade better than his position strictly warranted, with small, quick, pale eyes that went at once to the open ledger on the table before settling. With an effort, Frances did not fail to notice, upon her own face, and a manner of address pitched exactly between the deference owed to the Dowager Countess and the faint, unmistakable condescension he plainly considered due to any woman claiming an understanding of drainage. "Miss Standish, is it?" he said, bowing rather more to the room in general than to her in particular. "I am told you have been out upon the meadows this morning with your father's old instruments, a very filial attention, if I may say so, though I confess I wonder what use a lady's reading of a level can be to men who have managed this ground, one way and another, a good deal longer than Mr. Standish, God rest him, ever did. My father surveyed this ground for 9 years. Mr. Sowerby," said Frances, without heat, "and in that time the home farm sluice did not want mending twice in 1 12-month. I have this morning read the level at both sluices and along 1.5 miles of the main drain, and I find the fall of the ground exactly as my father's own survey recorded it in 1810. Which is to say sound. What I do not find sound is the work that has been done upon it since, which I should be glad to discuss with you in whatever detail you please. Account book in hand." Something moved behind Mr. Sowerby's small pale eyes at this. Not alarm, quite, for he was too practiced a man to let alarm show plainly upon so short an acquaintance, but a kind of swift private recalculation that Frances recognized. From 6 years of managing schoolroom disputes among clever, dishonest children, as the look of a man revising, upon the instant, his estimate of how much trouble a distinctive difficulty was going to cause him. "I am sure Miss Standish's father's survey was everything that is careful," he said. "But ground changes, my lady, in 9 years, as any farmer will tell you, and I should be sorry to see the estate's money spent twice over on works that answered well enough for their day but cannot, in the nature of things, answer forever." "Then we are agreed on one point at least," said the Dowager Countess, closing the ledger before her with a small, decided sound that made Mr. Sowerby's eyes flick toward it. "For I do not intend the estate's money to be spent twice over either, Mr. Sowerby, and it is exactly that question, what has been spent, and where, and to what effect, that Miss Standish is engaged to settle. I have told my son, and I tell you now, that she is to have whatever books, whatever men, and whatever access to the ground she requires, and that her judgment in the matter of the drains is to stand until she herself is proved wrong by better evidence than a gentleman's assurance that ground simply changes." Mr. Sowerby bowed again, murmured something civil about being entirely at Miss Standish's service, and took his leave with a composure that Frances, watching him go, did not for one moment believe was genuine. And that evening, walking in the last of the daylight along the terrace with her aunt, she found herself turning over, not the sluice nor the drain, but the marked quality of the look Mr. Sowerby had given the ledger before the Dowager Countess closed it, the look, she thought, of a man measuring the distance between himself and a very large amount of trouble, and beginning already to calculate how he might put something solid between the two. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Frances had not known since her father's death, and had not, until she was in the middle of it again, understood how much she had missed. Up before the house, out upon the meadows with Tom Redlock, and, as the work grew, 3 or 4 other fen men whose names she learned and whose confidence she earned, not by any manner she put on for the purpose, but simply by being right, morning after morning, about where the water would stand and where it would run once a given stretch of drain was cleared, home by firelight to write up her figures in the black-bound book that was fast filling with a hand she noticed, without much surprise, had begun to look less like her own everyday writing and more like her father's, small and careful and trusting nothing it had not itself measured twice. The main drain was the first work undertaken, and the hardest, for 3 years' silt does not lift itself, and the fen men worked in water to the knee through the worst of the clearing, cutting the choked reaches back to her father's original section and hauling the spoil up onto the banks in a long black windrow that steamed faintly in the cold mornings, and Frances walked the whole length of it most days, not to stand over the men in a manner that would have insulted them, but because she had found, within a week of arriving, that her presence upon the bank, level in hand, checking a fall here and a fall there, did more to keep the work honest and the pace steady than any amount of instruction given from indoors could have done. The Earl came out to the works more often than she had expected of a man with, she gathered from his mother's occasional dry remarks, a good deal else upon his hands that autumn, a mortgage to renegotiate, a magistrate's bench to sit upon, tenants to reassure who had not yet seen with their own eyes that anything was truly changing. And Frances came, without quite remarking the moment it happened, to expect him along the bank most afternoons, generally alone, sometimes with the spaniel, always asking questions that showed, week by week, a steadily improving grasp of what a sluice was for and how a drain failed, until by the first week of December he could stand beside her at a staff reading and follow, without her needing to explain it twice, why a fall of 4 inches in 100 yards made all the difference between ground that drained and ground that drowned. "You have made an engineer of me, Miss Standish," he said one afternoon, in the flat pale light of early December, watching her note a reading in her book with the particular satisfaction she allowed herself only when a figure came out exactly as she had predicted it would, or as much of one as a man past 30 and burdened with a great many other duties can well become. "I begin to understand why my mother thought so highly of your father, and why she thought, when the trouble came, that his daughter might answer where a stranger would not. I am not certain I have made anything of you yet beyond a man who can read a staff at 40 paces without squinting, said Francis, which is a beginning, but I would not call it engineering. My father used to say that any fool could read a level. The whole art lay in knowing what to do once you had read it, and that art takes longer than a season to learn. Then I shall have to hope the season is not the whole of my acquaintance with the subject, he said, in a tone light enough that she might have taken it for nothing more than pleasantry. Had she not, glancing up from her book, caught the singular steadiness with which he was looking at her, a steadiness she found herself, against her own better judgment, thinking of more than once in the quiet of her own room that night. She did not encourage the thought. She had come to Otterbourne to read water, not to fall in love with an earl who could, whatever the present state of his affections, look no higher for a wife than a woman of birth and fortune to match his own. And she set herself, with the same discipline she brought to a column of figures, to keep her attention upon the drain and off the especial gray-green steadiness of his eyes, a discipline that served her tolerably well through the daylight hours and failed her, more often than she liked to own, in the hour before sleep. The second sluice was rebuilt whole through the last fortnight of November, the rotten sill drawn entirely and a new one laid upon proper piling, the gate rehung true upon new hinges forged in Sleaford to Francis' own drawing. And it was over this work, more than any other, that the first open trouble with Mr. Sowerby broke. For the timber Francis had ordered, sound oak, seasoned, at a price she had satisfied herself was fair, by writing privately to a timber merchant of her own father's acquaintance in Boston, did not arrive upon the day promised, nor upon the week promised after that, until Tom Redlock, making his own inquiries among the carters, brought back word that the order had twice been countermanded from the steward's office, and the timber twice sent instead to a barn raising upon a farm that Mr. Sowerby, it transpired upon a little further inquiry, held some private interest in. Frances laid this before the Earl without heat and without delay, exactly as she had told him she would do, and watched his face go, not red with the easy anger of a man who enjoys his own outrage, but very still and very pale, in a manner she was beginning to recognize as the true danger sign in him, the one his mother's dry composure and his own quiet manner both concealed from anyone who did not look closely. He countermanded an order given in my name, for my money, upon my land, he said, and sent the timber to his own private profit. Miss Standish, I begin to think your rotten sluice sills are the least of what we shall find once we have found the whole of it. I think so too, my lord, said Francis, though I would rather we found the whole of it before we accuse him of any part of it, for a man cornered too soon has time to burn his books, and a man cornered too late has none. It was, she reflected afterward, the first time she had given him direct counsel upon a matter that was not, strictly, engineering, and she had half expected him to bridle at a schoolmistress advising an earl upon the management of his own steward. But he had only nodded, slowly, and asked her, in the tone of a man genuinely wanting her judgment rather than merely her information, how long she thought it would take to gather evidence enough to be certain. And she had told him honestly that she did not yet know, but that she would tell him the moment she did. December wore on, cold and still, the fen locked under a hard frost that, at least, Frances told the Dowager Countess with the nearest thing to satisfaction she permitted herself, stopped the ground from growing any wetter while the men worked, and by the third week of the month the main drain ran clear and full from the home farm sluice to the tidal doors. The second sluice stood rebuilt and true, and the long low meadow, where Frances had first seen the herons standing in a sheet of standing water, now showed, in the pale noon light, only the ordinary dark wet gleam of fen ground in winter. No longer flooded, only resting, as ground should rest, before the spring. The tenants noticed, before the Earl's own household did, in the way of country people who read a season by its water quicker than any gentleman reads it by his rent roll, and Frances found herself walking into Quarrington Fen village one Sunday with her aunt for morning service, greeted by name by men she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with, and by more than one wife pressed to accept a basket of eggs or a jar of preserve she had done nothing, in her own accounting, to deserve beyond doing competently the work she had been engaged to do. "You have done more for this parish in 6 weeks than Mr. Sowerby did in 3 years," said the Reverend Ashdown, walking beside her from the church door, "and I do not say it to flatter you, Miss Standish, for I do not think flattery is a coin you would care to be paid in. I say it because it is true, and because there are men in this parish who would have gone into the new year owing rent on ground they could not have worked, through no fault of their own, and who will not now, and I think you should know that this is understood and remembered, whatever comes of the rest of it." Frances did not know quite how to answer this, being unused to being thanked at all, let alone thanked so directly and so publicly, and said only that she had done nothing her father would not have done in her place, which was, she reflected, both true and a smaller answer than the moment perhaps deserved, but she carried the words with her none the less, through the cold walk back to the hall, with something that was not quite pride and not quite happiness, but stood, she thought, a good deal nearer to both than anything she had felt in the 6 quiet years since her father died. Miss Sowerby, for his part, did not remain idle while the meadows dried and the parish's gratitude grew. He called upon Frances directly at the small parsonage lodging she and her aunt occupied. A fortnight before Christmas, upon an errand he dressed, with his usual plausibility, as nothing more than a neighborly civility owed to a lady new to the district, and it was only some minutes into a conversation of studied pleasantness, the weather, the state of the roads, an inquiry after her father's health that he must have known, from any ordinary inquiry in the district, to be 6 years beyond answering, that Frances understood the true purpose of the visit had not yet been reached, and settled herself with the same patience she brought to a slow child's sums, to wait for it. "I wonder, Miss Standish, whether you have properly considered your own situation here," he said at last, turning his hat in his hands before the parlor fire with an air of confidential concern that did not, in Frances's private judgment, reach as far as his small pale eyes. "You are a stranger to this county, however welcome the Dowager Countess's kindness has made you feel, and estates are curious places, full of old loyalties and old grudges that a newcomer, however clever with a level, cannot always read as easily as she reads a drain. I have served this family 11 years. I have friends upon every bench and in every counting house between here and Lincoln. A young woman without fortune or connection, engaged upon no better footing than a season's hire, would do well, I think, to consider how very much easier her position here might be made, or how very much harder, depending upon whether she continues to press certain inquiries that do her, if I may say so as a friend, no credit at all." "You are telling me, Miss Sowerby," said Frances, setting down her needlework with the particular deliberate calm she reserved. For the moment a disagreeable truth needed to be named aloud rather than left to hover unspoken between two people, "that you believe my situation here to depend upon your good opinion, and that you are prepared to make that situation difficult should I continue to compare your accounts against the tradesman's own receipts. I will save you the remainder of the civility you plainly intend to spend upon the point, and tell you plainly that my situation here depends upon the truth of the ground and the truth of your ledgers, upon neither of which your good opinion or your ill opinion has the smallest bearing. I have read a great many figures in my life, Mr. Sowerby, and I have never yet found one that altered, because the man who wished it different spoke pleasantly or unpleasantly about it over a parlor fire. Something in his face changed at that. Not yet the naked recalculation she had watched cross it in the sitting room upon their first meeting, but something colder beneath the studied civility, a first thin crack in a manner he had, until that moment, kept very carefully whole. And he rose, gathering his hat with a stiffness that told her, more plainly than any further word could have done, that her answer had not been the one his visit had been designed to produce. I had hoped, he said at the door, that a sensible woman might be brought to see reason without unpleasantness on either side. I am sorry you do not find my meaning plain enough, Miss Standish. I dare say you will have occasion, before this business is done, to wish you had. I dare say I shall have a great many occasions before this business is done. Mr. Sowerby, said Frances, rising to see him out with a composure she did not, in truth, feel entirely settled in her own chest until the door had closed behind him. But I do not think wishing I had taken your meaning will be among them. Good evening. She told the Earl of the visit the following morning, exactly as she had promised herself she would tell him anything of consequence, and watched the same still, pale anger cross his face that she would come to recognize, in the weeks that followed, as his peculiar register of a fury too large to be safely spoken aloud in its first heat. He came to threaten you in your own lodging, he said, under cover of a neighborly call, because he had begun, I think, to understand that his ledgers would not survive much longer under your reading of them. I am sorry, Frances. I beg your pardon, Miss Standish, that you should have been made to sit through such an interview alone. I was not entirely alone, said Frances, for my aunt was in the next room the whole time, with the door very slightly ajar, and I do not think Mr. Sowerby left this house under any illusion that his visit had gone unwitnessed. And I would rather you called me Frances, my lord, if the slip was not entirely unintentional, for I find I have grown rather tired these last weeks of the formality between us answering so poorly to how plainly we have come to speak of everything else. It was, she reflected afterward, a bolder thing to say than she had quite intended, and she watched him consider it for a moment with an expression that told her the boldness had not been unwelcome, before he said, gravely enough that she understood he meant it as more than a mere civility returned, that he would be glad to call her so, and that he hoped, in time, she might find occasion to call him by a name a good deal plainer than his title, though he did not, that same morning, press her further upon what name that might prove to be. Mr. Sowerby did not call again, nor trouble her directly a second time. But Frances noticed, in the weeks that followed, a marked increase in the small, deniable obstructions that had already delayed the rebuilding of the second sluice, a carter's bill disputed here, a delivery mistakenly directed to the wrong parish there, a rumor, traced eventually to a Boston tap room, that the new Countess's engineering was all show and no substance, and would be proved worthless the first hard winter. Obstructions that troubled her a good deal less for their own sake than for what they told her of a man growing steadily more desperate as the true weight of his 3 years' fraud drew nearer to being fully and publicly weighed. It was in the first week of the new year that Mr. Sowerby, having watched 6 weeks of steady, visible, undeniable success undo, meadow by meadow, the whole comfortable fiction of unavoidable decay he had maintained for 3 years, made the move that Frances had privately been expecting since the matter of the countermanded timber, though she had not expected it to arrive dressed quite so respectably. Mr. Locksley, the Earl's solicitor, had come down from Lincoln as promised in December, and had been closeted a good deal since his arrival, with the estate's account books and with Francis's own careful notes upon what had and had not been spent where the ledgers claimed it had been spent, and it was a letter to Mr. Locksley, rather than any direct approach to the Earl, that opened the second and more dangerous phase of the business, a letter from a Boston money scrivener named Nathaniel Blackwell, who held, it now transpired, a bond upon a considerable portion of the Otterbourne estate, taken up by the late Earl's spendthrift elder son some years before, and never yet redeemed. Mr. Blackwell's letter, civil in its language and entirely uncivil in its substance, observed that he had received reports, he did not say from whom, though nobody at the hall was in any real doubt, that the present season's rents were like to fall considerably short of the sum required to meet the interest due at Lady Day, on account of flooding upon the water meadows so severe and so protracted that he had been advised the ground itself might be permanently injured, and that he must, in consequence and with the greatest reluctance, give notice of his intention to call in the whole of the principal at the earliest date the bond's terms allowed, unless satisfactory assurance could be given him, within the month, that the estate's income was equal to its obligations. He has been told the meadows are ruined, said the Earl, laying the letter down upon the library table with a hand that was, Francis noted, admirably steady for a man being asked to find, at short notice, a sum that would otherwise have had 2 years to be found in. He has been told this, Miss Standish, at the precise moment when you and I both know the meadows are drier and better drained than they have been in 3 years. Someone has gone out of his way to tell Mr. Blackwell a thing that is the exact opposite of true. Someone who stood to lose a great deal, once the truth of the drains became plain enough for even a Boston scrivener to hear of it, said Francis, and who has calculated, I think, that if the estate can be made to look as though it cannot meet its obligations, Mr. Blackwell may be persuaded to call in the bond before your own improvements can be shown to answer for themselves, and that, in the confusion of a forced sale or a forced mortgage, a good many inconvenient questions about 3 years' accounts might never be asked at all. It was Mr. Locksley, going through the estate's papers with a Lincoln solicitor's patient and suspicious thoroughness, who found the first plain proof of what Francis had, by then suspected for some weeks, 2 sets of figures for the sluice repairs, one rendered to the Earl and one, in a different hand and at a considerably higher sum, rendered to a timber merchant and mason in Boston, who had, upon Mr. Locksley's discreet inquiry, been paid the lesser figure and had been given to understand, by Mr. Sowerby himself, that the difference was to be accounted for as his own commission for procuring the work, a commission the 2 tradesmen had paid over to Mr. Sowerby in good faith, believing it, they said, to be the ordinary custom of the estate. It is not a subtle fraud, said Mr. Locksley, a dry, careful man of middle years, with gold-rimmed spectacles and a manner that concealed, Francis came to think, a considerable appetite for exactly this sort of unraveling, but it is a patient one, run small enough each year that no single sum would have looked remarkable set against the whole of a large estate's expenditure, and dressed up, always, in language calculated to discourage a gentleman unfamiliar with drainage works from asking the second question that would have exposed it. I have seen a good deal of this kind of thing in 30 years at the bar, my lord, and I will say this for Mr. Sowerby, he has been careful. But careful is not the same as safe, once someone has begun to add the small sums together instead of taking each one upon its own account. The confrontation, when it came, was not the scene of shouted accusation Francis had half braced herself for, but something colder and, in its way, more frightening, for Mr. Sowerby, summoned to the library on a wet January afternoon to answer for the discrepancy between the two sets of figures, did not deny the substance of the charge so much as attempt, with a composure that Francis privately thought remarkable in the circumstances, to shift the whole of the blame onto the tradesman's own dishonesty, and thence, when that failed to satisfy either the Earl or Mr. Locksley, onto Frances herself. "I do not say Miss Standish's figures are false," he said, standing very upright before the library fire with his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude he plainly intended to convey injured dignity. "But I do say that a woman new to this estate, however well-intentioned, cannot be expected to understand the whole of an accounting system built up over years, nor the private arrangements by which a steward must often smooth the path of works that would otherwise stall for want of ready tradesmen willing to wait upon an estate's convenience for their payment. I have served this family faithfully for 11 years, my lord, and I am sorry indeed to find that faithful service repaid with an inquiry got up, I cannot help but think, at the instigation of a person with every private reason to make her own engagement here appear the more indispensable the longer it continues." It was, Frances thought, listening to this with the same flat attention she had once given to a clever child's excuses for an unfinished lesson, both an accusation and a threat, delivered with just enough plausibility to give a less careful man pause. And she saw, from the sudden stillness that came over the Earl's face, that he had heard it exactly as she had. "Miss Sowerby," said the Earl, in a voice Frances had not yet heard him use, quiet and entirely without warmth, "you will confine yourself to the question of the 2 ledgers, or you will leave this room and this house within the hour and answer the whole matter before a magistrate instead of before me. I did not ask Miss Standish to manufacture a grievance against you. I asked her to tell me the truth about my own drains, because I could not get it from you, and she has told me a truth that is confirmed, item by item, by 2 independent tradesmen's own accounts of moneys paid to you under a name you gave them yourself. If you have an answer to that, give it now. If you have not, I would advise you to consider very carefully what you say next, for I am a considerably more patient man than my brother was, Mr. Sowerby, but I am not an infinitely patient one, and you have very nearly found the end of it." Mr. Sowerby found, in the event, no answer that satisfied anyone in the room, and left it, some minutes later, considerably less upright than he had entered it, with a fortnight's grace to set his own affairs in order before Mr. Locksley proceeded, on the Earl's instruction, to lay the whole matter before the county bench, and it was only after the door had closed behind him that Frances, sitting very still in her chair by the window, realized that her own hands, which had been perfectly steady throughout the interview, had begun, now that it was over, to shake very slightly in her lap. In the particular reaction that came to her always after, and never during, a difficulty she had faced without flinching. The Earl saw it, she did not know how, for she had thought herself well concealed by the fading light near the window, and crossed the room to stand near her, not touching her, but near enough that she felt more than saw the steadiness of him, which was, she thought afterward, exactly the quality she had first recognized in him upon the drain bank in November, and had been, without quite admitting it to herself, coming to rely upon ever since. "You did not flinch once, the whole time he was speaking," he said, "though I saw well enough what it cost you to hold so still. I begin to think, Miss Standish, that whatever your father taught you about levels, he taught you a good deal more than that." "He taught me," said Frances, her voice steadier now than her hands, "that a figure either adds up or it does not, and that a man's opinion of you, however loudly given, has no power at all over whether it adds up. I have found that a useful thing to remember, in a schoolroom and out of one." "I hope," said the Earl quietly, "that you will go on finding occasion to remember it here a good while longer than the season we first agreed." Frances did not trust herself to answer that directly, and said only, after a moment, that there remained the small matter of Mr. Blackwell's bond still to be settled, which was, she thought, both true and a smaller answer than the moment perhaps deserved. In a pattern she was beginning to recognize, with some private and not entirely unhappy alarm, as characteristic of exactly how matters stood, by January, between herself and the Earl of Otterbourne. Mr. Blackwell's bond was not, in the end, the small matter Frances had made it sound, and it occupied the whole of the following fortnight in a correspondence Mr. Locksley conducted with a patience Frances privately thought heroic, laying before the scrivener, letter by careful letter, the true state of the drains as Frances' own survey book recorded them, the rebuilt sluices, the cleared main drain, and, most tellingly, Miss Locksley judged, a sworn account from the 2 Boston tradesmen of the sums actually paid them against the sums Mr. Sowerby had represented to the estate, together with a plain statement that the steward responsible for the false reports reaching Mr. Blackwell's ears was, by the date of writing, no longer in the Earl's employment, and stood to answer the whole matter before the county bench. It took Mr. Blackwell a further 3 weeks to be satisfied. For a money scrivener who has been told a false thing does not, Frances came to understand, abandon his alarm merely because a solicitor tells him it was false. He required, in the event, to send his own agent down from Boston to walk the drains himself. A dry, unsmiling, entirely practical man named Hepplewhite, who spent 2 full days upon the meadows with Frances, checking her figures against his own instrument, a level she noted, with the marked satisfaction of one professional recognizing another's competence, was very nearly the equal of her father's, and it was Hepplewhite's own report, rendered directly to Mr. Blackwell over his own signature, that at last persuaded the scrivener to withdraw his notice and agree, upon the strength of what he called, in his letter to Mr. Locksley, ground put right by a more honest hand than the one that lately had charge of it, to let the bond run its natural term. "He very nearly praised you by name in a business letter," said the Earl, reading Mr. Blackwell's letter aloud to Frances in the library one gray February afternoon, with an expression that suggested he found this a good deal more remarkable than Frances herself did. "I do not think Mr. Hepplewhite is a man given to praising anyone lightly, from what Locksley tells me of him." "He is not," said Frances, who had found Mr. Hepplewhite's silent, exacting company over 2 days' work considerably more restful than most conversation, "which is exactly why I am glad of his good opinion, and would not have wanted it cheap." The matter of Mr. Sowerby himself came before the county bench in the first week of March, in a proceeding that Frances was required, somewhat to her private discomfort, to attend and give evidence at, laying before the magistrates, in the same plain, level voice she had used upon Mr. Sowerby himself, the whole history of the 2 ledgers, the countermanded timber, the patched sluices mended cheap and charged dear. And it was the Boston tradesman's own sworn evidence, more than any word of hers, that settled the matter. For a magistrate may discount a lady's figures as the enthusiasm of an amateur, however unjustly, but he cannot so easily discount 2 independent men of business swearing, upon oath, to sums paid and received. Mr. Sowerby was found to owe the estate a sum that Mr. Locksley computed, with the satisfaction of a man completing a long piece of unpleasant arithmetic, at very nearly £1,100 accumulated over 3 years, a sum Sowerby had no prospect of repaying and no property of his own consequence enough to answer it from, and the bench, having heard the whole matter out, committed him for trial at the next assizes upon a charge of fraud, a proceeding that would Everyone at Otterbourne understood without troubling to say so aloud. End in transportation, or worse. And that closed. So far as the estate itself was concerned, a chapter of neglect and quiet theft that had very nearly cost the Otterbourne tenantry 2 consecutive years' harvest, and the Otterbourne family the whole of an estate held in trust, in one form or another, since before the conquest. The last of it, the last true test of whether 3 months' hard, unglamorous, painstaking work upon a choked drain and 2 rotten sluices had truly answered, came not in any courtroom, but upon the meadows themselves, in the last week of March, when a spring tide higher than any recorded in the parish these 20 years came up the fen rivers on a night of hard south-westerly wind, and every farmer and fenman from Quarrington to the tidal doors turned out in the dark to watch whether the new sluice gates, built to Frances's own drawing upon foundations she had herself surveyed twice over, would hold against a sea that had, in living memory, broken lesser works and drowned lesser harvests before they were so much as sown. Frances stood at the home farm sluice from a little before midnight, wrapped in a heavy frieze cloak against a wind that came in off the fen edged with salt and cold enough to numb her fingers inside her gloves, with Tom Redlock and 2 other fen men holding a stable lantern between them so she could read the watermark chalked upon the new gatepost against the rising tide, and the Earl beside her, having come down from the hall the moment word reached him that the tide was making higher than any glass had predicted, standing with his shoulder near enough to hers that she could feel, through the noise of the wind and the black rushing water, the warmth of him as a fixed point in a night that otherwise offered nothing fixed at all. It will hold, she said, more than once, in the hours that followed, watching the water climb the chalked mark inch by inch and hold there, and climb again and hold. The new gate answering the pressure exactly as her own calculations upon her father's old drawing had told her it would, though she would not, she found, quite believe her own figures until she had watched the water itself confirm them, and it was a little before 4 o'clock, with the tide at last turning and the gate still standing true against a weight of water that would, by Tom Redlock's own flat estimate, have carried away the old rotten sill inside the hour, that she allowed herself, for the first time that night, to stop reading the watermark and simply stand, cold and salt-stung and entirely exhausted, in the lantern light, and admit to herself that it had in fact held. "You have saved this valley's harvest twice over tonight," said the Earl, quietly, so that only she should hear it above the wind. "Once in November, when you first read that drain, and once tonight, when your own gate answered a tide no one living has seen the like of. I do not know how a man properly thanks a woman for a thing of that size, Miss Standish, and I find I have been trying to think how for rather longer than tonight." "You need not thank me at all," said Frances, though her voice, she noticed, was not quite as level as she would have wished it, standing there with the cold going through her and the lantern light catching the exhaustion and something else, something warmer, in his face. "I have only done what my father taught me, and been paid a fair wage for it, which is more than most working men or women can say of their labor." "Then let me not thank you," he said, "but tell you instead that I do not think, whatever wage Locksley has settled upon you, that it comes anywhere near answering what this valley owes you, nor what I have come, these last months, to owe you myself, in a coin no solicitor's fee can properly reckon." He did not say more that night, for the hour was late, and the cold considerable, and the moment, Frances thought afterward, not quite the right one for what she suspected. From the singular steadiness of his look, he had been upon the point of saying, but she carried his words back to the hall with her through the last dark hour before dawn, turning them over the way she turned over a column of figures that did not, upon first reading, quite balance, and finding, upon a second and a third reading, that they balanced very well indeed, if she allowed herself to read them as what she rather thought they were. News of the tide, and of the new sluices holding, traveled through the parish and beyond it, a good deal faster than news of Mr. Sowerby's committal had done, for a flood averted is a thing every farmer in a fen country understands in his own bones. Whatever he may think of ledgers and county benches, and by the second week of April, Frances found herself, somewhat to her own private astonishment, spoken of as far off as Sleaford and Boston as the woman who had read the Otterbourne Water when the Earl's own steward could. Not an account that had grown in the retelling a good deal more dramatic than the plain, patient, unglamorous truth of levels read and figures checked twice that Frances herself would have given. Not everyone received the account kindly. There were, inevitably, drawing-rooms in Sleaford and in the county town beyond, where the notion of a schoolmistress directing an earl's drainage works was received as an oddity at best and an impropriety at worst, and word of this reached Frances, as such word generally does, by way of her aunt, who had it from a Sleaford acquaintance visiting Boston, that a Mrs. Pentridge of that town had been heard to remark at a card party that she did not know what young women were coming to, when a governess's daughter might set herself up as an engineer and go about correcting noblemen's stewards as though she had been bred to it. "I hope you do not mean to let Mrs. Pentridge's opinion trouble you," said Aunt Judith, relating this over breakfast with the particular relish she reserved for gossip. She had no intention of being troubled by herself. The woman has never in her life read a level nor balanced a column of figures that did not concern her own housekeeping, and I should like to see her stand upon a drain bank at 4 o'clock in the morning in a spring tide and tell me it was improper. "I am not troubled," said Frances, and found, upon examining the statement, that it was very nearly true. 6 years of managing a schoolroom had taught her a great deal about the especial uselessness of minding what people said who had never themselves attempted the thing they criticized, and she had, besides, the considerable comfort of knowing that her figures had held against an actual tide, which Mrs. Pentridge's opinions, however loudly voiced over a card table, had signally failed to do. It was the Dowager Countess, in the event, who dealt with Mrs. Pentridge's variety of opinion most decisively, by the simple expedient of inviting Frances to sit beside her, in a chair of unmistakable honor, at the assembly held in Boston that Easter, a public occasion attended by very nearly every family of consequence in that part of Lincolnshire, and by making it known in her own dry, direct manner to anyone who would listen, that Miss Standish had saved the Otterbourne tenantry 2 years' rent, and very possibly the whole estate besides, and that she, the Dowager Countess, considered any lady who could not find it in her to be civil to Miss Standish upon that account a poorer judge of true gentility than she had previously supposed. It was at that same Easter assembly, in a bow window, overlooking the market square, with the candles burning low and the dancing well advanced in the rooms behind them, that Frances had the conversation with the Earl that she would afterward remember as the true turning of the year, though nothing was said in it that could not, strictly, have been said between any two people of tolerable acquaintance. "You are watched a great deal tonight," he said, coming to stand beside her at the window, "and borne it, I think, rather better than I should have done in your place, being pointed out and whispered over by half the room." "I have been pointed out and whispered over by schoolroom mothers these 6 years," said Frances, generally upon the subject of whether their daughters had improved sufficiently in their arithmetic to justify my fee. "I find a ballroom's whispering considerably milder by comparison, whatever the subject." He laughed at that, a low, unguarded sound she had not often heard from him. For he was, she had come to understand over the winter, a man who kept his amusement, like his anger, mostly to himself. And then he was quiet a moment, looking out over the dark square, before he spoke again in a different tone, one she recognized, from the drain bank in November and the sluice at midnight in March, as the tone he kept for saying things he had considered carefully before saying. "My mother tells me," he said, "that your father and my own father were better acquainted than I had understood. I found, going through some old estate correspondence with Locksley last month, a packet of letters between them, going back above 15 years, upon matters that had nothing to do with drains at all. Books, mostly, and the education of daughters, and once, I think, a disagreement about the proper reading of Cowper that ran to 4 letters before either man would yield the point. I did not know my father had a friend of that peculiar kind, nor that your father was he. Frances had not known it either, not in any detail, though she had always understood, in the vague way a child understands things spoken of but not explained, that her father had held the old Earl in a regard that went beyond the ordinary respect of an engineer for his employer, and she found herself, hearing this, unexpectedly moved in a manner she had not been by any of the season's larger events, the sluice nor the tide nor the assize court. For there was something in the notion of her father and a dead earl arguing over Cowper by letter, 2 men she had thought she knew the whole shape of, that opened a small further room in her understanding of him she had not known was there to be opened. "He never spoke of it," she said. "I knew he had surveyed here, and that he thought well of the old earl. But I did not know there were letters." "I have had them copied for you," said the earl, "if you would care to have them. I did not think it my place to keep them from you. Whatever else was in them, and there is a good deal in them, I think that you would be glad to read, not least a passage, in one of the last, where your father writes that he considers his own daughter's understanding of levels and figures a good deal sounder than his own had been at her age, and hopes only that the world will one day find a use for it worthy of the pains he has taken over it." Frances did not trust herself to answer this at once, standing in the bow window with the candlelight and the distant music and the whole weight of a father 6 years dead speaking to her, suddenly and without warning, through a stranger's careful copying of an old letter. And the earl, watching her face, said nothing further for a long moment, only stood beside her in the particular steady silence she had come to value in him above almost anything else he might have said, until she had mastered herself enough to speak again. "I should like to have them very much," she said at last. "Thank you." "It is I who should thank you," he said, "for giving that old letter, written by a man who could not have known it, the truth of an ending he would have been glad to see. I do not think your father imagined, writing that the use the world would find for you would be quite so peculiar as saving his own old employer's grandson's inheritance, but I think, from what little I have read of him, that he would not have been surprised by it either." They did not speak of anything further that night that either of them would, upon reflection, have called a declaration. But Frances went home to the Hall in the Dowager Countess's own carriage, her aunt dozing beside her, and sat a long while at her window before she slept, turning over. Not a column of figures this time, but the marked quality of the earl's voice saying, "I do not think your father would have been surprised by it either," and finding that she was, herself, considerably less surprised by the whole turn her own life had taken than she would have thought possible 6 months before, when she had been nothing more than a schoolmistress with an old map she had not troubled to unroll in above of 12-month. Aunt Judith, meanwhile, had spent the winter forming an alliance of her own with the Dowager Countess that Frances observed with a private amusement she was careful never to let either lady suspect. For the two widows, having begun their acquaintance in November, upon the merely correct footing of hostess and chaperone of a hired engineer, had discovered between them, by the turn of the year, a shared and vigorous appetite for whist, a shared low opinion of a certain Boston attorney's wife who had once slighted them both at different assemblies a decade apart, and a shared conviction that the younger generation, whatever its evident merits in the matter of drains and ledgers, wanted considerably more managing in the ordinary business of the heart than it ever suspected it wanted. I have wagered your aunt a length of Norwich shawl that my son will come to the point by midsummer. The Dowager Countess informed Frances with considerable satisfaction one February evening. The two elder ladies having by then taken to sitting together most evenings over a card table drawn close to the library fire, while Frances and the Earl occupied themselves, ostensibly, with the estate's correspondence at the far end of the same room. Mrs. Marlitt holds out for Michaelmas, being, in her estimation, a niece of hers a good deal too sensible to be hurried, and a man of your husband's particular steadiness rather slower to declare a thing than to feel it declared. We shall neither of us say another word to either of you upon the subject, of course, being far too discreet for anything of the kind, but I do not think either of us means to lose so agreeable a wager for the want of a little quiet patience. You are wagering upon a matter neither of us has said a single word to suggest, said Frances, torn between laughter and a lingering astonishment at the frank thoroughness with which her own private affairs had apparently been canvassed, over a card table, by two women old enough to be her mother. My dear, said Aunt Judith, not looking up from the hand of cards she was at that moment engaged in losing to the Dowager Countess, with a grace that suggested she did not greatly mind the losing. I have watched you since you were 11 years old, and I knew, the very evening you came home from Ruskington describing his lordship's spaniel in more detail than his lordship, that this was not a wager I should lose by waiting too long to make it. A woman does not describe a strange gentleman's dog with such particularity unless she has already begun, whether she knows it or not, to take a very singular interest in the gentleman himself. Frances had no ready answer to this, having entirely forgotten, until her aunt recalled it to her, that she had indeed remarked upon the spaniel at some length during that first week at Otterbourne, and found herself obliged to retreat, laughing, to the far end of the library, where the Earl, catching the tail of the exchange, inquired with evident amusement what especial crime his spaniel now stood accused of, and received, in answer, only that she would not for the world repeat to him everything his own mother and her own aunt had between them contrived to notice before either principal party in the matter had properly noticed it themselves. It was, Frances came to think over the following weeks, one of the quieter satisfactions of her whole strange year at Otterbourne. This steady, unlooked-for friendship between the two women who had each in her own fashion done the most to shape her aunt's dry, practical, entirely unsentimental affection, learned across 6 years of a shared household in Sleaford, and the Dowager Countess's equally dry but no less genuine regard, earned across a single winter's plain, speaking upon a rain-wet garden path, and she thought, watching the two of them bent together over a card table on a February evening with the fire crackling and the estate's affairs, for once entirely set aside, that whatever else her father's teaching had brought her to, it had not brought her to this particular happiness alone, but had brought with it, by ways she could never have predicted from a rolled map in a Sleaford cupboard, 2 households worth of women glad, each in her own idiom, to call the arrangement a very good one. Spring came on properly through the last weeks of April, the water meadows greening under a run of mild, showery weather that Frances read, from long habit, as much for what it promised the drains as for what it promised the eye, and the estate settled, by degrees, into a new and steadier pattern under a new steward. A plain, careful, entirely unremarkable man named Amos Fenwick, recommended to the Earl by Mr. Hepplewhite as honest above all other qualifications, who took Frances's own survey book as his working gospel and troubled her with questions often enough that she came to think of him, within a month of his appointment, as very nearly a second Tom Redlock, only with a desk and a set of ledgers to mind as well as a drain. Her engagement, which had been made for a season, was quietly extended, first by a month, and then by a further 2 upon terms that grew, each time they were renewed, a shade less like a hired engineer's wages, and a shade more like the settled arrangement of a woman who had become, without anyone quite naming it so, an indispensable part of the life of the place. And Frances, walking the home farm most mornings still, though the drains now wanted only watching rather than mending, found herself teaching 2 afternoons a week at the small parish school in Corrington Fen, where the Reverend Ashdown had asked her, tentatively at first and then with real eagerness once he had seen her at it, to give the older girls what plain arithmetic and drawing she had once given the attorney's daughters of Sleaford, and where she discovered, greatly to her own surprise, that she had missed the schoolroom rather more than she had allowed herself to know. Among the parish children who came to her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons was Tom Redlock's own eldest girl, Nan, a quick, watchful child of 11 who had, Frances noticed within a fortnight, a peculiar gift for figures that outran, by a considerable margin, anything the rest of her class could manage, and who had taken, moreover, to lingering after the other children had gone upon one pretext or another to ask Frances a further question about the arithmetic of the morning's lesson, or to watch, with an attention Frances recognized at once from her own girlhood, whenever the level and staff happened to be laid out upon the schoolroom table for some demonstration of the principles behind the drainage works everyone in the parish had by then heard so much of. "You would like to hold it, I think," said Frances one wet afternoon in February, catching the child's eye fixed upon the level's brass fittings with an expression that needed no further translation, and set the instrument into Nan Redlock's hands with the same care her own father had once used in first putting it into hers. It is not a difficult thing to read, once you understand what it is telling you. It only wants patience, and a willingness to trust your own eye over what anybody tells you the ground ought to be doing. She gave the child, over the weeks that followed, exactly the sort of grounding her own father had once given her. The reading of a staff, the keeping of a book, the plain, unglamorous discipline of checking every figure twice before trusting it, not because she supposed Nan Redlock would ever be permitted, by the ordinary arrangements of a Fen laborer's daughter's life, to make a living of it as Frances herself had improbably come to do, but because she had found, teaching the child, that she understood at last something of what her own father must have felt, teaching her that a piece of true knowledge, once properly given, does not ask permission of the world's opinion before it takes root, and may yet find, in some manner neither teacher nor pupil can predict, its own eventual use. "You are making a new Miss Standish of my Nan," said Tom Redlock, not without a certain rough pride, meeting Frances upon the home farm bank one March morning, while the child in question walked ahead of them along the drain, with a borrowed staff held very straight and very seriously against her shoulder. "I don't know as the world's quite ready for 2 of you, my lady, but I'll own I'd rather my girl grew up reading water true than not knowing one end of a level from the other, whatever comes of it after." "The world was not ready for one of me either, Tom, by most accounts," said Frances, watching the child crouch to squint along the staff exactly as she had once crouched beside her own father upon that same stretch of ground, above 19 years before, and I have found, upon the whole, that the world comes round to being ready a good deal faster than anyone expects, provided the work itself is done honestly and well. I do not know what use Nan will find for a level, in the end, any more than my own father knew what use I should find for his teaching when he first put a chain into my hands. But I do not think either of us need trouble ourselves overmuch upon that account. A true figure is a true figure, whoever comes to read it, and the ground does not ask a reader's history before it consents to be truly measured. This exchange, reported to the Earl that same evening over dinner by way of the Dowager Countess, who had heard it in turn from Mr. Fenwick, occasioned in him a satisfaction Frances found, when she heard of his hearing of it, rather more moving than she had expected any second-hand report of her own small kindness to be. "You are building something here that will outlast the drains themselves," he said, "and I do not think you have yet fully understood how much larger a thing that is than the mending of a single estate's sluices, valuable as that mending has been. My father spent a great deal of money, in his time, trying to leave Otterbourne better than he found it, and left it, in the end, encumbered and half-drowned for his son's improvidence to compound. You have spent a season's wage and a good deal of patience, and left it, I think, with something no amount of money could have purchased. A fen laborer's daughter who now believes, upon the plain evidence of her own instructed eye, that a woman's understanding may go exactly as far as she is willing to train it, and a parish that has watched the proof of it with its own eyes for above a 12-month. Frances did not know, that distinctive evening, quite how to answer so large a compliment, and said only, after a moment, that she hoped Nan Redlock might make rather better use of the training than her own history suggested was strictly probable for a fen laborer's daughter, to which the Earl replied, with the dry steadiness she had come to love in him nearly as much as his patience, that he did not think probability had ever yet stood in the way of anything Frances Standish had set her own mind to proving true, and that he saw no particular reason it should begin doing so now, upon so promising a second case. You have made scholars of children who could not, in November, tell me the difference between a foot and a yard, said Mr. Ashdown one afternoon, watching her set a row of fen children to measuring the schoolroom floor with a borrowed rule, and I begin to think, Miss Standish, that whatever else this parish gained when you came to read our water, it gained a schoolmistress it did not know it wanted, and I hope very much it need not lose her again too soon." Frances, hearing this, found herself obliged to look rather more closely than usual at the row of children's rule marks upon the floor, for she did not, in that moment, trust her own face to give away nothing of the marked uncertainty the Reverend Ashdown's question had touched upon, for the truth, which she had not yet said aloud to anyone, not even her aunt, was that she did not know, herself, how long her place at Otterbourne could properly continue, nor upon what footing, once the drains were mended and the fraud punished and the ordinary business of an estate resumed its ordinary quiet course, a schoolmistress turned engineer might honestly be expected to remain in the household of an earl who had, by every sign she could read, and did not entirely trust herself to read rightly, come to feel for her something a good deal warmer than gratitude for mended sluices. She raised the difficulty, in the end, not with the Earl himself, whom she did not yet trust her own composure to face upon the subject, but with the Dowager Countess, walking with her one wet May afternoon along the gravel path of the walled kitchen garden, where the Countess had a habit of taking exercise regardless of weather, and had, more than once that spring, drawn Frances into a confidence Frances had not quite intended to give. "I do not know, ma'am, upon what footing I properly stand here now," Frances said at last, when the Countess's own silence had grown long enough to seem an invitation rather than a discouragement. The drains are mended. Mr. Sowerby is answered for. I have done the work I was engaged to do, and done it, I hope, honestly, and I do not know that it is proper for me to go on accepting your son's hospitality, nor his continued patience with my presence, upon no better ground than that the work is finished and I have grown, I own it plainly, reluctant to leave. The Dowager Countess stopped upon the path and looked at her for a long moment with the direct gray eye Frances had learned over 6 months to value for its honesty above almost any other quality she had met in that household, and then said, in the dry, plain manner that Frances had come to understand, her singular way of being kindest. Miss Standish, I am 61 years old, and I have watched my son's face for 36 of them, and I will tell you plainly what I have seen in it these last months. Since you will not ask him directly, and I do not think he has yet found the courage to tell you without being asked, he has been in love with you, by my own reckoning, since very near the week you arrived, and has held his tongue upon it only because he did not wish you to feel, while you were still in his employment and dependent, in however small a degree, upon his good opinion, any pressure that a woman in your position might have found impossible honestly to refuse. He is, whatever else he is, an honorable man, and an honorable man does not court a woman he is paying a wage to, however much he may wish to. I think, if you will forgive an old woman's plain speaking, that the only real question before you is not upon what footing you stand here, but whether you can bring yourself to tell him you would not, after all, find the question of his own feelings so very impossible to answer, were he ever to find the courage to ask it. Frances stood in the wet garden with the rain coming down soft and steady upon the box hedges, and said nothing for a long moment, for the Dowager Countess had, in her plain way, said aloud a thing Frances had spent above 5 months very carefully not saying aloud even to herself, and when she did speak, it was only to say, in a voice not quite as level as she would have wished, that she did not think she would find it impossible at all, which the Dowager Countess received with a small, satisfied nod as of a difficult sum at last correctly cast, and said only that she was very glad to hear it, and that she thought her son had waited quite long enough, honor or no honor, and that she meant to tell him so directly, whatever either of them thought of her interference. Whether the Dowager Countess did in fact tell him so directly, Frances never learned for certain, though she suspected, from a certain heightened color about the Earl's countenance at dinner 2 evenings later, and a marked tendency in the Dowager Countess to leave the room upon the flimsiest of pretexts whenever her son and Frances were together, that some plain speaking had indeed passed between mother and son, and it was upon the evening of the 2nd of June, a warm, still, late-lit evening, with the whole of the home meadow gone gold under a sun that seemed reluctant to set at all, that the Earl asked Frances to walk with him as far as the home farm sluice, the very gate her own hands had drawn and her own figures had proved against. The March tide, and there, standing beside the quietly running water with his hat set down upon the sluice post between them, said the thing Frances had by then spent above a fortnight privately certain he meant, sooner or later, to say. Miss Standish, he said, and then stopped, and looked out over the meadow a moment, at the long gold light lying across grass that had been, 7 months before, 3 feet under black flood water, before he began again in a steadier voice. Frances, I have stood at this gate with you in a January frost and a March tide and 100 ordinary mornings besides, and I have found each time that I would rather be standing at this gate with you than anywhere else in England with anyone else living. I had not, when you came into Lincolnshire last November with your father's old instruments and your aunt beside you, expected this evening. I have loved you. With what patience I could manage, and what discretion my own position required of me. Very nearly since that first morning I found you reading a staff upon this bank, with a laborer holding your chain. And I have held my tongue upon it these 7 months, because I did not think it honorable in a man to press his own feelings upon a woman he was, for the greater part of that time, paying a wage. I am not paying you a wage any longer, in any sense that need trouble either of us, and I am asking you now, upon no better ground than that I have loved you steadily since that first November morning, to do me the honor of becoming my wife. You have known me, by the world's ordinary reckoning, too short a time to be certain of your own heart in the matter, and I will not press you upon that score if you are not certain. I ask only that you consider the question at your own time and answer me upon your own terms, and that if your answer is no, you will believe that the arrangement between us and your place in this household for as long as you wish to keep it continues entirely unchanged, and the question shall never be raised between us again. Frances stood beside him at the sluice gate with the evening light gold upon the water, and found that she did not, in fact, require any great length of time to consider an answer she had, if she was honest with herself, been arriving at by careful degrees since a cold morning in November, when a tall, grave, unannounced man had come up a drain bank with a spaniel at his heel and asked her, without ceremony, to tell him plainly what she had found. "My lord," she said, "I do not think I require a great deal of time. I have read a great many figures in my life that did not balance upon a first inspection, and proved, upon a second and a third, to balance a good deal better than I had first supposed, and I find this is very much such a case. I have loved you, I think, since a good deal earlier than either of us has troubled to name aloud, and I do not intend, having read that figure through as carefully as I read any other, to pretend I have found it wanting when I have not. I shall marry you, and gladly, and I do not think my father, wherever he is, will be surprised by it either." He did not say anything further for a long moment, only took her hand, the same hand that had held a level steady against the wind off the German Ocean at 8 and 10 years old, and had, more lately, held a staff steady against a rising tide at 4 o'clock in the morning, and stood with her at the gate in the last of the gold light, saying, when at last he did speak, only her name, once, in a voice that told her a good deal, more than any further speech could have done, and it was in that attitude, hand in hand at the sluice gate with the home meadow gold and green behind them, that Tom Redlock, coming along the bank upon some ordinary evening errand and stopping short at what he had very evidently not expected to interrupt, first carried the news to the rest of the estate, a piece of intelligence that reached the kitchen at Otterbourne Hall before Frances and the Earl themselves had so much as walked back from the meadow, and was received there, by every account Frances afterward heard of it, with a satisfaction very little short of the household's own. The Dowager Countess, informed of the engagement that same evening by her son in terms considerably more formal than the news strictly required, given that she had herself all but engineered the moment a fortnight before, received it with a composure Frances suspected concealed a very great deal of private triumph, and said only, taking both Frances's hands in the same gesture she had used upon the evening of Frances's arrival, that she had known, from the first week her son's face had begun to change whenever Miss Standish's name was mentioned, that she would one day have the pleasure of calling her daughter, and that she was very glad the pleasure had not, after all, been so very long delayed. "You will make him a countess who knows the value of a shilling honestly spent," she said, "which is a rarer quality in this rank of life than the world generally supposes, and I do not think, in 36 years of watching this family's fortunes rise and fall, by exactly that measure, that I have ever been gladder of a son's choice. The banns were called for the first time upon the following Sunday, the 7th of June, in the parish church of St. Botolph at Corrington Fen, the Reverend Ashdown reading the familiar words with an evident pleasure he did not trouble to disguise, and the church, Francis noted, unusually full for an ordinary Sunday, every pew crowded with tenants and fen men and their wives who had, over the preceding 7 months, come to regard the news with something very like personal satisfaction, as though the mending of their own drains and the mending of their landlord's heart had been all along a single piece of work. Aunt Judith received the news of the engagement with a composure she did not, in the event, manage to sustain for above a quarter of an hour, before dissolving into a happiness so unguarded that Frances, who had rarely seen her aunt anything but dry and self-possessed, found herself laughing for the first time in some weeks at the sight of Mrs. Judith Marlett, weeping frankly into a pocket handkerchief over a teacup, declaring, between one application of the handkerchief and the next, that she had always known, from the very first reading of the Reverend Ashdown's letter back in November, that no good could come of sending a lady with her father's instruments into Lincolnshire, and that she had never in her life been so entirely delighted to be proved right about anything. "I shall write to your mother's cousins in Boston this very evening," she announced, recovering herself sufficiently to pour a fresh cup, "for they were used to speak of your father's calling as a very inferior sort of employment for a gentleman, however honestly followed, and I find I am not above a little natural satisfaction in being the one to tell them that his daughter is to be a countess by exactly the same knowledge they were pleased to look down upon." The wedding clothes occupied a good deal of the following weeks for the Dowager Countess, once it was settled that the marriage should take place at Corrington Fen rather than in London, a decision Frances made without hesitation, and one the Earl endorsed as readily as she had hoped he would, both of them agreeing that a marriage begun upon a drain bank had no proper business concluding. Anywhere grander than the parish that had watched the whole of it unfold, insisted upon sending to Lincoln for a mantua maker of her own long acquaintance, a brisk, capable woman named Mrs. Corbett, who arrived with a trunk of patterns and fabrics and pronounced, within an hour of taking Frances's measure, that she had dressed a good many brides in her time, but never one, she thought, with quite so little vanity, nor quite so much good sense about what actually suited her. "You are not a woman who wants a great deal of trimming, Miss Standish," said Mrs. Corbett, holding a length of dove-gray silk against Frances's shoulder and considering the effect with a professional eye, "and I have learned, in 30 years of this trade, that the plainer sort of beauty answers best to the plainer sort of cut. We shall have this in dove gray, I think, with old lace at the throat, and very little else besides. And you will be the handsomest bride Corrington Fen has seen in a generation, without a single furbelow to your name." Frances, who had never in her life given a great deal of thought to her own appearance beyond the plain requirements of decency and warmth, found herself rather liking Mrs. Corbett's brisk good sense upon the subject, and stood patiently through 3 long fittings in the last fortnight of June, while the dove-gray silk was cut and fitted and the old lace, a length that had belonged, the Dowager Countess told her, to the Earl's own grandmother, and that she pressed upon Frances with a warmth that made the gift a good deal more than merely material, set carefully at the throat and wrists. Frances made, in the midst of those same weeks, one further journey back to Sleaford, alone but for her aunt's own housemaid to accompany her, in order to close up the small brick schoolroom with the green door where she had taught arithmetic and plain drawing for 6 quiet years, and to take a proper leave of the attorney's and corn factor's daughters, who had been, until the previous November, the whole occupation of her days. The girls had heard, by then, a good deal of the story, embellished, as Aunt Judith's own tellings had embellished it, considerably beyond the plain truth of levels and ledgers, and received her upon her last morning among them, with a mixture of awe and affection that Frances found unexpectedly difficult to bear with proper composure. Several of the older girls having got up between them a small worked sampler, stitched with a border of forget-me-nots and the single line, taken from a copybook maxim she had made them write out above 100 times in 6 years, that a figure honestly cast will answer honestly asked. "You will not forget us, Miss Standish, now that you are to be a countess," said the youngest of them, a solemn child of 9 who had struggled all that winter with her multiplication tables, and had lately, under the stimulus of her teacher's own extraordinary elevation, begun at last to master them. "I am not at all sure yet what I am to be called," said Frances, kneeling to be nearer the child's own height, as she had done 100 times before in that same schoolroom. "But I know very well what I have been these 6 years, and I do not think becoming a countess changes a single figure of it. You will go on with your tables whether I am here to hear them or not, and I shall expect, when next I visit Sleaford, to find you have not forgotten how 6 sevens are reckoned, whatever else may have altered in the meantime." She locked the schoolroom door for the last time, with a feeling very unlike the composed satisfaction she had brought to every other closing of that same lock across 6 years, and walked back to her aunt's house on Handley Street, past the square brick shop fronts and the familiar corn market, with an oddly divided heart, glad beyond measuring of everything that awaited her at Otterbourne, and yet conscious, in that last Sleaford afternoon, of a genuine and unsentimental gratitude toward the plain, patient, unremarkable years the schoolroom had given her, years that had taught her, quite as thoroughly as her father's own instruction upon the water meadows, the particular discipline of doing an unglamorous thing correctly and without complaint, day after day, until the doing of it became simply the shape of a life well spent, whatever grander shape that life might afterward, unlooked for, come to take. There remained, through those same weeks, the ordinary business of the estate to be minded, for a betrothal did not stop a fen from wanting its drains watched, nor a harvest from wanting its ground kept dry, and Frances continued her mornings upon the meadows very much as she had done since November. Though Tom Redlock and the new steward, Mr. Fenwick, had taken over the greater part of the daily watching by midsummer, leaving her the pleasanter task of walking the banks for her own satisfaction rather than her employment, a distinction she found, more than once that June, brought her a contentment she had not thought to find in idle walking after 7 months of purposeful work. It was upon one such walk, in the last week of June, that she came upon the Earl at the second sluice, the very gate whose rotten sill had first told her, in November, the whole shape of Mr. Sowerby's neglect, standing with his hand upon the new hung gate exactly as he had stood upon the evening of his proposal, and looking, when she came up beside him, not at the water, but at her, with an expression she had come, over 7 months, to read as easily as any figure in her father's books. "I have been thinking," he said, "that this gate has done a good deal of work in the history of our acquaintance, beyond the mere holding back of water. It was here I first understood what a rotten thing had been done to this estate, and here you first showed me the difference between a man mending appearances and a man mending drains, and here, not 3 weeks since, I asked you to marry me. I begin to think we ought to have some inscription cut into the post, for the benefit of whichever Fenwick or Redlock comes after us, and wonders why the present Countess of Otterbourne takes such an especial interest in a plain wooden sluice gate." "I do not think an inscription is necessary," said Frances, laughing, "though I own I shall never look at a well-hung gate again, for the whole of my life, without thinking of this one and everything that has followed from it, My father used to say a good sluice was the plainest, most honest piece of engineering a man could build, because it asked for nothing but that it should do exactly what it was built to do, neither more nor less, and I begin to think there is a great deal to be said for choosing a husband upon the very same principle. And have I done exactly what I was built to do, Francis? Neither more nor less? He asked, with the peculiar dry lightness she had come to love in him nearly as much as his steadiness. You have done a good deal more than I expected. When a strange letter came to my aunt's breakfast table last November, she said, and I do not think, upon the whole, that I could ask a sluice gate or a husband for any higher recommendation than that. The third and final banns were called upon the 28th of June, and the wedding itself was fixed for the second Tuesday of July, a date the Dowager Countess had chosen, with her customary practicality, for standing safely between the last of the hay harvest and the first of the corn, so that no tenant should be obliged to choose between his landlord's wedding and his own livelihood. And the whole of Quarrington Fen, by every account Francis afterward heard of the arrangements, spent the intervening fortnight in a state of preparation that a stranger might have mistaken for a preparation against siege. So thoroughly did every cottage garden yield its flowers, and every farm its cream, and every good wife her best receipt toward a wedding the parish had, in its own collective judgment, as much claim upon as the bride and groom themselves. Francis woke on the morning of the wedding to a July day of the particular clear, high, golden quality the fen produces perhaps a dozen times in a summer. The mist burned off the low ground by 7 o'clock, and the sky above St. Botolph's tower, a blue so entire and so unbroken that Aunt Judith, dressing her niece's hair with hands that trembled very slightly with an emotion she made no further attempt to disguise, declared it a sign of Providence's own distinctive satisfaction with the match, a sentiment Francis did not trouble to dispute, being disposed that morning to find Providence's hand in a good deal that a more sceptical temper might have set down to ordinary summer weather. The dove-gray silk, when Mrs. Corbett's needlewomen had finished the last of the fitting, sat exactly as Mrs. Corbett had promised it would, plain and well cut and entirely without furbelow, the old lace at throat and wrist catching the morning light with a soft, worn, generation's deep luster that Francis thought, looking at herself in the long glass in her chamber, suited her a good deal better than any newer, showier fabric could have done. And she carried, at her aunt's marked insistence and against her own inclination toward plainness, a small sprig of oak leaves cut from a tree in the home park that the old Earl himself was said to have planted the year the drainage works were first begun, a piece of symbolism Aunt Judith considered entirely too apt to be left ungathered. The church of St. Botolph, when Frances arrived there in the Dowager Countess's own carriage with her aunt beside her, stood already crowded a good half-hour before the appointed time, every pew filled, and the churchyard beyond thick, with those who could not find room within. Fen men in their best broadcloth, and their wives in bonnets kept for exactly such occasions. The lane running down to the porch lined, on both sides, with hay carts and gigs and the fine coaches of half the gentry of that part of Lincolnshire, all come to see a schoolmistress from Sleaford, married to the Earl of Otterbourne, in the same plain church where, 7 months before, no one would have thought to look for either of them. Tom Redlock stood near the light gate with his wife and his eldest boy, and touched his hat to Frances as she passed, an unspoken acknowledgment of a whole winter's shared labor that meant, Frances thought, a good deal more to her than the finer bows of the assembled gentry, and the Reverend Ashdown, waiting at the church door in his surplice, with a face composed for the occasion but unable entirely to conceal his own particular pleasure in officiating at a match he had himself, however unwittingly, first set in motion with a hastily written letter the previous November, received her with a warmth that steadied her, she found, rather more than her aunt's careful instructions on the proper bearing of a bride had managed to do. The Earl was waiting within, tall and grave in a plain dark coat that Frances thought suited him a good deal better than any more elaborate wedding finery could have done, and turned to watch her come up the aisle on her aunt's arm with an expression that the whole crowded church, by the small murmur that ran through it, plainly read as clearly as Frances herself did. And the service proceeded. In the Reverend Ashdown's steady voice, through the old familiar words, to the moment when the Earl of Otterbourne took Frances Standish's hand, the same hand that had held a level steady at 8 and 10 years old, and a staff steady against a tide at 4 o'clock one March morning, and a chain coiled without a kink in it for the whole length of a choked and silted drain, and promised before the whole assembled parish to keep her in sickness and in health for as long as they both should live. They came out of the church a little before noon into a July sun so bright that Frances, stepping from the cool dimness of the nave into the churchyard, was obliged to shade her eyes a moment before she could properly see the crowd that had gathered along the path, a crowd that broke. At the sight of the new Countess of Otterbourne upon her husband's arm, into a cheer that startled the doves from the tower and carried, Tom Redlock afterwards swore, clear across the home meadow to the very sluice gate where the whole business had begun. There was a wedding breakfast at the hall for the gentry, and a harvest supper's worth of ale and cold meat set out upon trestle tables in the park for the tenantry, and Frances moved between the two through the whole of that long golden afternoon with a happiness she found she had no singular words to describe, being more accustomed, by 6 years of schoolroom discipline, to measuring things than to feeling them without measure, and it was not until the light began at last to slant low and gold across the home meadow, and the last of the tenantry's toasts had been drunk, and the fiddler in the barn had struck up a tune that sent even the more sober of the farm wives onto the trodden grass to dance, that she found a quiet half-hour to slip away with her husband to the second sluice gate, where they stood together, her hand in his, watching the water run clear and steady toward the tidal doors in the last of the evening light, exactly as it had run every day since the previous March, and exactly, Frances thought, as it would go on running for as long as anyone troubled to keep the drain clear. And the gate sound, which was, she reflected, very nearly the whole of what she had ever wanted to be sure of, in this life or any other. The Lincoln Assizes sat upon Mr. Sowerby's case in the last week of July, a fortnight after the wedding, and the sentence, when it came, was transportation for a term of 14 years, a judgment the whole parish of Corrington Fen received with a grim, unsurprised satisfaction that Frances, sitting beside her husband in the courtroom to give her evidence a second and final time, found she could not entirely share, feeling, despite everything the man had done, a small private sorrow for the waste of a competent understanding turned, through greed and long habit of deceit, to exactly the wrong purpose. A sorrow she confessed to her husband upon the ride home, and that he received, she was glad to find, not as a weakness in her, but as further proof of the same clear-eyed justice that had first exposed the man. You are sorry for him, and unmoved by him in the very same breath, he said, which I begin to think is exactly the temper that makes you the woman you are, Frances. You would not have let him alone for one moment out of that same sorrow, and you did not, but you feel it all the same, because you are not in the habit of mistaking a man's punishment for a cause of satisfaction, only for a plain consequence of what he chose to do. I do not think I have ever met anyone else who managed both at once so easily. Missy, Blackwell's bond, redeemed in full from the estate's now recovering rents by the following Lady Day, occasioned a final civil letter from the Boston scrivener to Mr. Locksley, expressing, in terms that Locksley read aloud to the Earl and the new Countess with considerable private amusement, his especial satisfaction at having dealt, in the end, with an estate conducted upon principles a man of business might trust as readily as any bond, and rather more readily than most, a compliment that Frances, hearing it, thought a fitting enough close to the whole strange business that had begun with a wet letter at her aunt's breakfast table the previous November. The autumn brought Frances a fresh and unlooked-for occupation, for word of the Otterbourne drainage, how it had failed, and how a woman's competent hand had mended it, and how the whole valley's harvest had been saved thereby, had traveled, by the ordinary channels of agricultural gossip, considerably further than Boston and Sleaford, and she found herself, before the leaves were fully down, in receipt of 2 separate letters from neighboring landowners in the fen country, each asking, in terms a good deal more deferential than Mr. Sowerby had ever managed, whether the Countess of Otterbourne might be persuaded to look over a troublesome stretch of drain upon their own land and give her opinion of it. "I did not marry an idle countess then," she said to her husband, reading the second of these letters over the breakfast table with an expression he had come to recognize, in the 5 months of their marriage, as her particular look of quiet pleasure at a piece of work well set before her. "You did not," he agreed, "nor did I ever imagine, courting you upon a drain bank in the middle of a flood, that I was courting a woman who would consent to sit idle once the flood was past. Go and look at Sir Pelham's drain if you wish it, and take Fenwick with you if you like a second opinion at your elbow, and I shall count myself the most fortunate man in Lincolnshire to have a wife whose Tuesday mornings are spent reading water instead of embroidering fire screens." She went, in the event, and looked at Sir Pelham's drain, and at 3 others besides before the year was out, riding out from Otterbourne with her father's level in its case and her own black-bound book of readings, now grown to a second volume in a hand that no longer troubled to distinguish itself from her father's, for she had long since ceased to think of the 2 hands as separate, having come, in the 2 years since his death, to understand that the surest way of keeping a thing alive was not to mourn it, but to go on using it exactly as it had been meant to be used. Aunt Judith removed, that autumn, to a small, comfortable house upon the edge of the Otterbourne Park, near enough to visit daily and far enough, as she herself observed with characteristic dryness, not to be under everyone's feet at a young countess's own table, and continued, from that vantage, to relate to anyone who would listen the whole history of the strange letter that had once arrived at her breakfast table, embellishing it, with each fresh telling, by some small additional flourish that Frances, overhearing her aunt's account to a visiting cousin one December afternoon, no longer troubled to correct, having come to think that a story so well loved deserved, perhaps, a little license in the retelling. Even Mrs. Pentridge of Boston, whose opinion of governesses' daughters setting themselves up as engineers had once traveled as far as Sleaford, was heard by the following spring to remark at a different card party that she had always thought Miss Standish, she still, out of some private stubbornness, declined to style her Lady Otterbourne in conversation, though she did so correctly enough upon paper, a young woman of very sound understanding, a revision of opinion that reached Frances by the same circuitous route as the original slight had done, and that she received, this time, with nothing more than a private and not unkind amusement at the entire predictability of the world's readiness to admire whatever it had, a 12-month before, been pleased to despise. The winter that followed the wedding was a hard one. The fen locked under snow for above 6 weeks in the new year, and Frances spent a good part of it not out upon the drains, which required, in a frost, only watching rather than working, but in the Great South Library at Otterbourne Hall, a room she had visited perhaps twice in her first months at the estate, and had come, over the year of her marriage, to think of as very nearly her own peculiar province, second only to the meadows themselves. For it was there, among her husband's family papers, that Mr. Locksley had at last finished the long task of setting the whole of the estate's accounts upon a clear and honest footing. And it was there, in a locked case that had belonged to the old Earl, that Frances found, one snow-bound January afternoon, the complete correspondence between her father and her husband's father that she had, the previous Easter, been given only a single copied passage of. She read the whole of it through in a single sitting, by the light of the library fire, while the snow came down soft and steady against the tall windows, and her husband sat opposite her with his own book forgotten open upon his knee, watching her face rather than her reading. And she found, in those old letters, a portrait of her father she had not fully possessed before. Not merely a careful, quiet, competent land agent, which she had always known him to be, but a man who had argued fiercely and affectionately across 15 years of correspondence about poetry and politics and the proper raising of daughters, who had once written, in a letter dated the spring before Frances's own birth, that he hoped very much for a daughter rather than a son. For I find I have a great deal more patience for teaching a clever girl than I ever had for the ordinary vanities of clever boys, and I should like, before I am done, to prove to this county that a woman's understanding wants nothing but the same plain training a man's wants, and will answer it exactly as well. He knew, she said at last, closing the last letter, and sitting a moment with her hand flat upon the worn paper, much as she had once laid her hand flat against a rotten sluice timber, to feel the truth of it. He knew, before I was even born, what he meant to make of me, and I never once thought to ask him why, only accepted it as simply the shape our life together happened to take. I think, said her husband, that most daughters do not think to ask their fathers why, until they are grown women themselves and have daughters, or the prospect of them, of their own, to wonder over. I am glad the letters answered the question for you, even if it took my own father's dying and mine own inheriting to bring them at last into your hands. Spring came again in its ordinary course, the second spring of Frances' marriage, and brought with it a home farm harvest of hay so abundant, upon ground that had lain 3 years under standing water before her arrival, that the Dowager Countess declared it, at the customary quarter-day dinner in the steward's room, the best crop Otterbourne had seen in above a decade. A judgment, Mr. Fenwick's own careful ledgers, kept now upon principles Frances had herself taught him, bore out to the last honest shilling, and Frances walked the meadows that April much as she had walked them in her first November at Otterbourne, level in hand, though now for the pure, unhurried pleasure of confirming what she already knew to be true, rather than for any anxious necessity of discovering what might be wrong. She had taken that second spring to working a corner of the walled kitchen garden herself, a plot the head gardener had surrendered to her with some private scepticism as to what a countess who spent her mornings reading water levels might make of a flower bed, and had planted there, among other things, a slip of rowan she had begged from the old tree by the home farm sluice, on the theory, only half in jest, that a tree grown from wood that had watched the whole drama of the drains unfold ought to have some distinctive virtue in it. And it was there, kneeling in the black fen soil with her sleeves turned back and her husband's old spaniel dozing in the sun beside her, that Mrs. Otway, the housekeeper, found her one bright May morning, a letter in her hand that had come up from the receiving office at Boston that same hour. "From Mr. Hepplewhite, my lady," said Mrs. Otway, who had served the family long enough to have grown entirely easy with a countess who gardened in her oldest gown and answered to reading water levels a good deal more readily than to matters of household precedence. Asking might he trouble you for your opinion of a drainage scheme he is engaged upon for a gentleman near Spalding, the ground being, he writes, uncommonly like our own. Frances read the letter kneeling there among the young rowan and the first of the season's gooseberry blossom, and found herself smiling, not merely at the compliment implied in so exacting a man's asking her opinion at all, but at the whole strange, sound, well-drained shape her life had come to take, a schoolmistress's daughter's chain and level, once carried across wet grass for a father who had believed, before she was born, that a woman's understanding wanted nothing a man's did not want also, now sought after by careful men of business the length of the fen country, and married, besides. To a man who counted her Tuesday mornings spent reading water a greater gift to their marriage than any quantity of embroidered fire screens could ever have been. "You will write to him, I suppose," said her husband, coming into the garden in time to catch the end of Mrs. Otway's message and the particular light in his wife's face that he had, by then, learned to recognize as the look of a woman about to be usefully occupied. "I shall," said Frances, "though not before I have finished this row of gooseberries, for I have found, my lord, that a garden, like a drain, wants finishing properly before it is left, or the whole of the season's work goes for nothing. Then I shall sit here and watch you finish it," he said, settling himself upon the low garden wall with the patient, steady attention she had first learned to value from him upon a drain bank in November, above a year and a half before. "For I find I have never yet grown tired of watching you finish a piece of work properly, whether it concerns a sluice gate or a row of gooseberries, and I do not expect, whatever else changes between us in the years to come, that I ever shall. There are stories that begin with a kiss, and stories that begin with a ballroom, and stories that begin, as so many of this very county's stories are fond of beginning, with a sealed letter and a stranger's unlooked-for legacy. And there are stories, longer in the proving and slower in the asking, of a patience that had to be earned by plain, wet, unglamorous work before it was ever rewarded by a single tender word. Stories that begin, as this one began, with a rolled map in a cupboard, and a rotten sluice gate, and a woman who had been taught, long before she had any notion of where the teaching would lead her, that a figure either adds up or it does not, and that the truth of a thing, once properly measured, does not alter for anybody's convenience, be he a dishonest steward or a doubting neighbor, or, in the end, a lord who had everything in the world to offer her except, until he had earned it fairly, her own settled heart. The second harvest supper of Frances's marriage fell, that year, upon a warm September evening very like the one that had followed her wedding, the same great timbered barn hung with the same lanterns, the same long trestle tables groaning under a plenty that 3 years before nobody at Otterbourne would have thought the flooded, silted, neglected water meadows capable of yielding again in this generation, and Tom Redlock, grown stouter and grayer in the 2 years since he had first carried Frances's chain across the wet November grass, stood up at the head of the tenants' table, as he had taken to doing each autumn since the drains were mended, to propose the toast that had become, by long habit, the singular ceremony of that particular evening. "To the lady who read our water when nobody else in this valley could," he said, raising his tankard to a chorus of answering voices that filled the barn from floor to rafter, and to his lordship, who had the sense to listen to her, which is a rarer virtue in a great man than the reading of a level itself, whatever the school books may say. Frances, sitting beside her husband at the head of the table with a happiness she had long since stopped trying to measure by any figure her father had ever taught her to keep, raised her own glass to the toast and found, looking down the long lantern-lit table at faces she had come to know as well as any in Sleaford. Tom Redlock's wife and children missed. Fenwick bent gravely over his own tankard. Mrs. Otway presiding at the far end with the especial satisfaction of a housekeeper whose household has at last come entirely right. The Reverend Ashdown deep in some theological dispute with Mr. Locksley that showed no sign of resolving before the fiddler struck up. That she could not, that evening, have named a single figure in her whole life's long accounting that she would have wished altered, saving only the wish, familiar to her as an old ache, that her father might have lived to see the ground he had surveyed in 1810 answering, once more, exactly as he had always sworn it would answer, if only somebody troubled to keep the water moving. She said as much to her husband, walking back to the hall together in the last of the harvest supper's lantern light, the whole home meadow, silvered under a full September moon, and the mended drain running quiet and unseen beneath the grass at their feet, carrying off toward the tidal doors the same steady, patient, unremarkable competence that had once seemed to a schoolmistress in a square brick house in Sleaford. The whole and entire limit of what her father's teaching could ever be good for. "He would have been proud of you," said the Earl, "though I think, from everything I have since read of him, he would have told you plainly that he expected nothing less. And that pride was rather too grand a word for a man who only ever asked that a figure should add up honestly. I think he would have said, instead, that you had simply done the sum correctly, and that the sum, once done correctly, could not have come out any other way." "That is exactly what he would have said," said Frances, and found, walking beside her husband under the harvest moon with the mended drain running quiet beneath the grass and the whole valley's second good harvest safely gathered in, that she believed it entirely, and that believing it, at last, after 2 years of proving her father's teaching against a flooded meadow, a fraudulent steward, a threatened bond, and a rising spring tide, felt very like arriving, after a long, careful survey conducted line by line and figure by figure, at the one sum that had been waiting, patiently and without any doubt of its own rightness, for her to find it all along. And so, upon a warm gold September evening in the second year of her marriage, walking home across a mended, well-drained, quietly prospering fen beside the husband whose patient asking she had answered at a sluice gate of her own building, Frances, Countess of Otterbourne, who had once carried her father's chain across wet November grass, believing that a woman's understanding of levels and figures could never be more than a private and unregarded accomplishment, and who had come, instead, to save a whole valley's harvest by exactly that same plain, unglamorous, entirely reliable knowledge, understood at last that she had been right, all along, about the one thing her father had ever truly taught her, that a figure either adds up or it does not, and that hers, tested against every flood and every fraud and every doubting voice a hard 2 years could bring against it, had added up, from the very first reading to the last, exactly as it was always going to add up, and would go on adding up, she did not doubt, for as long as there was water in the fen to be read, and a hand patient enough and honest enough to read it truly.